Okay, so occasionally the Rotary clubs in the area work together to bring in a speaker who then hits multiple Rotary clubs giving the same speech. So Beatrice Brailsford, this is going to be her 5th presentation this week for Rotary clubs. She is the Nuclear Program Director for the Snake River Alliance, and she lives in Pocatello. She is a former professor from the University of Idaho, and she has been with the Alliance for since 1987. And just as a quick thank you, it was Marianne who lined the program up for us from the Buell Club to help get Beatrice here to speak to us today. So please help me welcome Beatrice.
Well, I kind of feel like maybe I'm on the cusp of the box. Now I might be a little taller than I normally are. Technology always creates at least as many problems as it addresses. I didn't tell you about this, but we'll get to it. Thank you very, very much. This is going to be confusing. First, I want to say what a pleasure it has always been for me to speak to the Rotary clubs. My father was a Rotarian. Many people I know are Rotarians, and I have a good deal of respect for the kinds of community services you do here in your own towns and nationally and internationally. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Today I want to tell you a little bit about the Snake River Alliance. The Snake River Alliance was founded in 1979. We are Idaho's grassroots nuclear watchdog and clean energy advocate. I think a lot more people know about our work on nuclear issues, but we are in fact very active in the clean energy arena as well. I am going to be speaking today on the Idaho National Laboratory. That is Idaho's sort of place in the nuclear world. The Idaho National Laboratory was built on the upstream end of the Snake River Plain, eastern north end. It is on the Arco Desert, so it's about 5,000 feet above sea level. It is at the feet of the Lemhi, Lost River, and Pioneer Mountain ranges. It is has been the home of humans for more than 10,000 years. So it's a very kind of dense, rich place. The Idaho National Laboratory was founded there in 1949. One of the problems with the place where it was founded is that it is above the Snake River Aquifer, which, as you know, you guys know more about the Snake River Aquifer probably than anyone in this state. The Snake River Aquifer has as much water in it as Lake Erie. It flows southwest under the state. It underlies about 10,000 square miles of Idaho's high desert plain and is in fact Idaho's lifeblood. The Idaho National Laboratory, I can't do that, never mind that. The Idaho National Laboratory, founded in 1949, covers 890 square miles of that high desert. And it has been the home of a lot of different kinds of nuclear activities over the years. There's a listing of some of them, but I think what's most notable is that everything that has happened there has either created or attracted nuclear waste to Idaho. The people of Idaho have, I think, been very concerned about what goes on at the Snake River Alliance, and certainly very concerned about nuclear waste coming into our state. We have, in fact, probably, first started opposing it in the 1970s. In the late 1980s, plutonium shipments from Rocky Flats were stopped from coming into this state. And then in the early 1990s, the people of Idaho started training their attention on trains like this, bringing in spent nuclear fuel for, quote, interim storage. What spent nuclear fuel is it is probably it's one of the most radioactive substances on Earth. What happens, uranium fuel is put in the reactor to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. And in that nuclear chain reaction, the fuel is bombarded, and it itself becomes more and more radioactive. And over time, it becomes so radioactive that it can no longer efficiently sustain a nuclear reaction. So the fuel is removed from the reactor and replaced. The fuel that's removed is said to be spent. It is not at all spent. It's in fact very, very radioactive. The concern in Idaho was that fuel was coming in for, quote, interim storage, but there was never a sign that anything was ever going to leave. So everyone, I think, stood together against the shipments, and that gave the state government a very firm ground to negotiate with the federal government. And finally, in 1995, the state of Idaho, the Nuclear Navy, and the Department of Energy signed a court settlement. The state had sued the federal government that did a number of things. It kind of increased the political will of the federal government to really go after the contamination that was at the Idaho National Laboratory. The contamination that's being cleaned up now is being cleaned up under federal laws, the Superfund law, the hazardous waste law, but there's always a little bit of political will in there. And I think the fact that the settlement agreement was there was an incentive for the feds to do as good a job as, in fact, they have. There's some real problems right now with some of the more difficult waste streams, but a lot of progress has been made. The agreement also, I think the most important part that the agreement has played in Idaho's environmental future is that it absolutely bans the importation of commercial spent fuel into this state. Now, we already have a lot of spent fuel in this state. We have, I think, 300 tons of spent fuel. It is stored a little buried, little below water, and then there are some dry cask storage facilities above ground. That's where the core debris from 3 Mile Island was brought to Idaho, ostensibly for research. But the last shipments of the core debris of 3 Mile Island came to Idaho after the research program had ended. A couple of weeks ago, there was a hearing here in Idaho, in Twin Falls, about the Nuclear Navy's plan to build a facility so that it can continue to bring spent fuel to Idaho. By the end of the day, the Nuclear Navy will have brought spent fuel to Idaho for more than a century. That spent fuel is brought here ostensibly for examination and research, but there is certainly a significant portion of it that does not undergo detailed examination. So given that we have so much spent fuel in Idaho, why are we worried about commercial fuel? Well, fundamentally it's because it's such a big waste stream. It's very, very radioactive, and it's huge. This pie chart shows how little that little pink splinter is what the government owns. The rest is all from the commercial power industry. They have 75,000 cubic meters, and that stockpile grows by about 2,000 metric tons every year. So here we are in Idaho. We have the strongest shield against spent fuel shipments of any state in this country. But there are very strong moves to change that. The contractor that runs the Idaho National Laboratory has been modifying facilities for years to accommodate that bigger waste stream. Not the whole waste stream, but the bigger fuel elements that might come in. They have been building new facilities, modifying old facilities. In 2011, the state of Idaho and the Department of Energy signed a memorandum of agreement, a side deal, essentially, that allows the site to bring in 400 kilograms of commercial spent fuel in any given year. For research, it's called a research quantity. The state has to grant that waiver for a specific shipment to come in. Last winter, the Department of Energy started talking with the governor and the attorney general about, in fact, bringing in two very specific shipments. Each shipment would have 25 rods, and 25 rods all told weigh about 100 pounds. Each rod is about 12 feet long. It's about as big as a pencil. The first shipment that would come in would be used to research pyroprocessing. Pyroprocessing is a form of reprocessing. Reprocessing is the must-take step between a nuclear reactor and a nuclear bomb. The Alliance and many other groups around the world worried about the proliferation of nuclear weapons has long opposed pyroprocessing. The second shipment that the feds want to bring in comes from the North Anna Power Plant in Virginia. And it is 25 rods, same amount. It comes in for research on what is called high burnup fuel. Over the years, the nuclear industry has started leaving their fuel in their nuclear reactors for longer periods of time. That's essentially so they don't have to shut down and refuel so often. It raises the profit margin. So the problem is, though, the high burnup, the fuel is hotter for longer, and the cladding around the fuel rod, becomes less ductile, and therefore more brittle, more likely to crack, more likely to break. So these shipments, this 25 fuel rods come in. They are, each one, no fatter than a pencil. They're tiny, tiny. They will be what's called they come in and they're the ground, they're the baseline for what did this fuel look like right when it came out of the reactor. And that's all the Department of Energy talks about. These fuel rods will come in, 25 of them, to establish a baseline. But these skinny sisters have a big sister. The plan is 25 rods, 100 pounds, comes in now, and 5 to 10 years later, the fuel that the baseline is being established for has to go someplace, and we're better placed than Idaho. We have all these new facilities, we have all these modifications, and we can do this research, particularly most importantly, if we have already let the first shipments in. Now, sometimes I think people think that, why wouldn't the government have told us that? And I don't know the answer to that. But maybe I do. But I am going to play you a recording. A couple of years ago, the governor of Idaho established what is called the Leadership in Nuclear Energy Commission advisory board, something, to give him advice on what happens with Idaho's nuclear endeavors. In 2013, John Grossenbacher, who is the head of Battelle, which is the contractor for the Idaho National Laboratory, which he also, in no small measure, runs. So he knows what he's talking about. He addressed the Leadership in Nuclear Energy Commission exactly about this plan. They talked all about the 25 rods, the 100 pounds, and then they really got down to it.
The 55 tons until 2035 was agreed upon, the DOE.
Sorry. Well, I don't know that it's going to work. I should have told my media expert that I had this before. I'm going to give it one more shot, okay?
Now, Shannon showed us 27 tons left of that allocation, so I'm not sure DOE could give that up because they still have plans for, it's research reactor fuels and other fuels. It depends on how much flexibility they have left, and I don't know the answer to that yet. So this could be, a big deal. It would be 20 metric tons heavy metal of commercial fuel, which is not allowed by the settlement agreement right now, and certainly is not a 400 kilogram research quantity. So this would be a big deal. It's not as Shannon also said, it's not a near-term issue. It's probably 5 years away at the earliest. To do this, this is a significant change from the settlement agreement. Right. We're talking about 20 tons of commercial fuel. And again, even though, there was 55 tons allowed and there's still 27 tons left, that 27 tons capacity was earmarked for other uses, and it was never intended to be commercial. So it would be a big deal. And it would require, the approval of the state authorities. It obviously would be an issue of significant public interest, and appropriately so. So it's not too early to, in my opinion, to start talking about this.
And then about half an hour further into the program, into the meeting, it wasn't an all-day meeting, but it was a meeting, Mr. Grossenbacher went a lot further. And remember I said that one of the real firm concerns from people about what comes into Idaho is how long it will stay and what does interim really mean.
Because obviously, for the lab to engage in this, it would require the state's approval, and the people of Idaho, accepting the additional burden of large amounts of commercial nuclear fuel moving in and out of the state, and some amount of it, always here. That's, I don't know what it would be, but it would be significantly bigger than it is today. So that's not a trivial thing, and there's not a process to right now to define this activity other than the framework we have with the administration and the DOE plan that says once the federal government changes the law and allows them to do it, they'll spend money in developing an interim storage site, a prototypical interim storage site, and interim storage sites and a repository. This will become part of that discussion at some point. We don't know when, but again, from the standpoint, and I know the chairman and others here have participated in discussions with representatives from different states that represent themselves in groups like the Energy Community Alliance. Again, if I were a state interested in becoming an interim storage site, I would want this mission. And whether can be done in Idaho or not. Whether Idaho wants to be an interim storage site is yet another question and a bigger question. But this mission is almost embedded in that, but not visible. It's visible.
Oh, I'm sorry. He finished by saying it's visible to us. I think Idaho has answered the question of whether or not we want to be an interim storage site for spent nuclear fuel. The Alliance has been a participant in nuclear debates about what happens with nuclear waste for a number of years. I myself am right now on the advisory committee for, it's the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is a kind of Washington think tank. And they have an advisory committee to talk about moving forward on solving the nuclear waste problem. What this council has done for the last year, we've gone around the country. We went to New England, we went to the southern states, we went to Chicago, we went to Washington State, the San Onofre, where the reactor has just been shut down, talking with people, official people, regular people, about what it would take to have a successful nuclear waste program. And part of going around and taking the temperature of people in various parts of the country is because the federal government really is wanting to move in order to succeed into a kind of consent-based paradigm. So a little bit of the question is, what would your community need to consent to a burden such as nuclear waste? And what we have found across the country is that there is very little confidence in the federal government's ability to or intention to fulfill its commitments. And I think what we're seeing here in Idaho demonstrates why this is so. Here in Idaho right now, we have the strongest shield against nuclear waste of any state in this country. And the feds are almost bullying our leaders to accept more spent fuel. Always only going to be at 100 pounds or 20 tons or a lot. I don't know how much. And it has started, I think, I know you had an article in the newspaper this morning that, Mr. Otter said yes to these shipments and now has said almost nothing. Mr. Wasden wants some very fair, firm obligations met before he discusses a waiver, and he is being bullied. If Idaho can't decide in 2 months to take nuclear waste for however long we'd have to take it, I don't know, the threat is that we wouldn't get it, and maybe that's okay. So I look forward to answering any of your questions. I'm sorry I went over my time. I had a lot going on here at the podium. But questions, comments, sir?
Let's discuss Yucca Mountain. What's the Snake River Alliance position on Yucca Mountain and a permanent repository?
The Snake River Alliance supports deep geologic disposal, and in fact that's the law. There are certain waste streams, high-level waste, spent fuel, and waste that's contaminated with plutonium. The law is that those waste streams have to be disposed of, isolated away from the human biosphere. And that, for all intents and purposes, means deep geologic disposal. Yucca Mountain, I don't think, Yucca Mountain had some very serious technical problems over the years. If you've got a site that the USGS has to change its numbers to make sure the site fits, you got a bad site maybe. But more important, or as important, the people of Nevada never wanted that. That's why we've tried to move into the notion that a community has to consent. Not just one guy in the state or two guys in the state, but the state. Nevada, during the recession had the highest unemployment rate of any state in this country, and they did not waver in their opposition to Yucca Mountain. They didn't say, well, now that we're we're so poor, let's consider it. So I think, so yes, spent fuel has to eventually go to a deep geologic repository. Our position is that nuclear waste should be stored as safely as possible, as close to its point of generation as possible. Because what we have seen, starting in 1949, if nuclear waste moves, it just moves once.
I'm a little confused about the threat of withholding $20 million a year of money from the federal government for this processing experiment. Now, is that $20 million that we now get as part of INEEL, or is this $20 million of new money that would come with the process?
No, it is, I can't remember what the wording is, but it is currently, it's money we already get. And in addition, in the environmental assessment about this project, both projects, the analysis was that no jobs would be created.
So you're saying it's government blackmail, that they're going to take away what we already have if we don't consent to accept the nuclear waste?
You might want to ask a federal official that question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.